Hello everyone. In this video I'll tell you a little bit about the Pandas GroupBy statement. I hope that this statement is useful to you in your future development or research projects. So just to get us started, this is a data file that you might be a little bit familiar with because we saw it in class earlier in the semester. In this data file I just have last names here, things like Smith, Johnson, Williams, and so forth. The percentage of the population that has that last name, the cumulative percent, which just adds up these percentage numbers as we go along, and then the rank of that last name in the population if you just sort them from most popular to least popular. Now we're just going to start with this data set, but the question that we're going to ask is what percentage of the population has a particular first letter of the last name. So I want to know what percentage of the population has a first letter S in their last name, what percentage has a first letter J, and so forth. And we're going to use the Pandas GroupBy statement to do this. So let's begin by just importing pandas and SciPy, and then just reading in the data frame. So here's our data frame. It's exactly what we saw in this spreadsheet. The first few rows are just Smith, Johnson, Williams, and so forth. So the GroupBy statement is just on a data frame, and you can read the documentation for it, and the documentation is extensive like most other complex functions in Python. But the most important part here is the by parameter. And you can read the documentation here. It's a mapping function or a list of functions or a dictionary or a series or column names. But the way that it's most useful to think about this is that the by parameter returns a value, and the data frame is split based on that value. So the most common and easy way to do this is by passing in just a single column name. So to do this, let me just create a new column here. So let's say new column is just going to be equal to 0. But let's say that I'm going to say that in locations where the surname starts with S, or the surname is null, new column is going to be equal to 1. Now let's take a look at just those first few rows of the data frame. So this is the new column we created, and it's 1 in all the locations where the surname starts with S, and 0 for all the other locations. So the reason I did this was just so that I can pass a new column into GroupBy. So let's do that. So by is just going to be just new column. And that returns something called a Pandas GroupBy object. And this object has a lot of things on it, but maybe some of the most useful ones are groups, which is a dictionary. And I'm not going to print groups because it's a very big dictionary in our case, but let me just print out the keys for groups. And the keys are two things, the number 0 and the number 1. And these keys come from the values that this by function returns. So new column only had two values, just 0 and 1, and that's why we had the corresponding two keys 0 and 1. And when I look at answer groups sub 1, that returns all of the indices in the original data frame that correspond to that particular value. So these are all the row numbers of last names that start with S. So just to connect this a little bit more, if we look at this, I mean these numbers right here. That's what groups 1 is returning. So this is just row numbers, but let's pull out just the entire data frame rows of all the last names that start with S. So to do this, we're just going to do answer locations, data frame locations that correspond to group 1 of answer, and we're going to take all the columns. And as you can see, these are all the last names that start with S. And similarly, if I looked at the group that corresponded to the key 0, then it's going to be all the last names that correspond to non-S last names. So that's the simplest use of the group by statement. But of course, we want to do something more complicated. So let's go back to how we called it. So here, in the simplest use, we just passed in a column name, and that grouped the data frame by values in that column. But instead of doing this, what we're going to do is we're going to pass in a little function, and then the data frame is going to be grouped by that function. So here I'm going to group by surname get 0. So before I execute this, let me just show you what this returns. So get 0 just accesses the first letter of that surname column. So this was Smith, Johnson, Williams, and so forth. So let's call DataFrame GroupBy, where we're grouping by surname the first letter of surname, and let's store that in a variable that we'll call answer. So if now I look at the keys of that groups attribute of answer, the keys are all the different potential first letters, so A, C, B, E. So these are not coming in any order, of course, because this is a dictionary, and dictionaries don't have a particular order to them. So, but these are the keys in that dictionary. It's all the potential first letters. So these are all the different things that the function we passed in, this get, actually returned. Okay, so if I wanted to get all of the last names that begin with A, I could do a similar exercise as before, and I could just look at data frame locations and look for groups that correspond to the key A, and take all the columns, and there are all the A last names. Of course, all the A last names, the new column is going to be 0 because we made new column to be 1 just for the S last names. So let's take a look at the S last names, and their new column is 1, and of course any other letter like B or something like that. These are all the B last names. Their new column is going to be 0. But okay, so this is how we took that big data frame and we quickly broke it down by the first letter of the last name. But our question was, what fraction of the population has a last name that begins with B? And to do that, I basically have to take this data frame of all the B's and sum up this percentage column. And I have to do this for the A last names, the C last names, and all the rest of the first letters. Now, writing a little loop to do this would be, you could do it. It would be reasonably complicated, but not too complicated, only 2 or 3 lines. But the group by statement has that capability built in. So let's use that. And in particular, that capability is in these functions, ag and aggregate. So let's just take a look at ag. For this function, you pass in the way that you want to aggregate. So this is a function to use for aggregating groups. If a function, it must either work when past a data frame or when past a data frame apply. If past a dictionary, the keys must be a data frame column name. So the way that we're going to use this is we want to aggregate that. We're going to use this dictionary first functionality. We want to aggregate that percent column. Right, so this was the column that we wanted to sum. And what we want to do with that column is we want to sum it. So I'm just going to pass in scipy.sum as the value corresponding to that particular column name. And when we look at the answer that gets returned from doing this aggregation, the indices here are just those first letters of the last name. So that was the A, B, C, D, and so forth. And then these are the percentages associated with them. So A has 2.6% B has 7.3%, and so forth. So let's store that in something that we call, let's say, aggregated. And let's just sort aggregated based on its percent column, with the biggest number on the top. And let's do it in place. And now if I look at aggregated, it tells me that the most popular first letter of the last name is M, and that's about 7.7% of the population. The next most popular is S, that's 7.3% of the population, then B with 7.3, C with 6.2, and so forth. And the least popular ones are Q, U, and X, with each about 0.1% or less. So this is the Pandas GroupBy statement. It's extremely useful, and it works much, much faster than writing the corresponding for loops by yourself in Python. And for those of you that are familiar with SQL, the GroupBy statement directly corresponds to the GroupBy statement in SQL query languages that you might be familiar with. And so it's something that's just very, very useful when working with data sets. So I hope that you find it useful in your future research or development projects. Thank you very much for listening.